Hi, this is the Philosophical Angle, and I am your host, Chris Angle. Along with me is my co-host, Rick Samuelson, a venture capitalist out on the West Coast. Rick graduated from Yale and is now with me. Good to see you, Rick.
Good to see you.
The purpose of the Philosophical Angle is to analyze the nature and essence of concepts being used in current media. This week, we're going to discuss the candidates for president are all discussing foreign policy. So our concept is foreign policy, and the application is the Middle East. So let's get started. Let's bring up a little diagram here that I've put together. So the candidates in both parties are opining on foreign policy issues in the Middle East, and it's quite prevalent in the debates. On both sides, both the Democrats and the Republicans are discussing this, and it brings up the decision or the problem of how to make decisions on the Middle East. In other words, what does the American foreign policy, what should it be in regards to the Middle East? How do you make a decision? How should a country make or approach a decision of foreign policy anywhere throughout the world, but mostly in this presidential campaign in 2016, we're looking at how to make them in the Middle East. So how would the United States, how should it approach uh, constructing a policy to approach the Middle East on its foreign policy decisions? Well, first let's go and take a look at how decisions are made in general. And anytime you make a decision, you have to decide its risk versus the reward. How much risk is there in acquiring the reward that you seek? But really, that's not the entire situation, because there are other factors in addition to risk. It's your total sacrifice, which involves your knowledge and your information that you have to make the decision, your time and your effort, in addition to the risk. So when it comes up to approaching the Middle East, there's a conflict there, and a potential for war. So you have a risk of increasing that war, and you have the time involved in making war and involving yourself in a conflict. And you have beyond that, you have the soldiers' efforts and soldiers' death toll, and the total cost and time to be involved in whatever efforts that are required in making in starting an effort to the Middle East. But there are other even related consequences, for example, that would extend into the future. How would the present conflict, if you were become involved in the present conflict, how would that change the future? And we see that in Iraq. We went into Iraq. We made a military presence there. We quelled any resistance. But then we left, and it created a vacuum. No longer was Saddam Hussein there as the area's strongman present, so we were not present. Saddam was not present. Consequently, there's an authoritarian vacuum. And what happened? Well, the invention of the Islamic State. The news pretty much calls it ISIS, but the Islamic State has reduced its former moniker from ISIS down to Islamic State. And that's what they seek to be known as. The Islamic State is is really a new state. They've got their own government in place and funding it with oil reserves and acting like a regular country. Another consequence that you'd have to consider in making any decision toward foreign policies, you have to consider the history of the area, and which I don't think the United States did very well, because the history of the Middle East has been really a history of conflict, of war, ever since the days of Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, who died in 632. So but in all cases, you have to think, what are the American interests? In other words, how should we make our sacrifices to attend our rewards? And that American interest is the reward that we seek in making our decision in what to do in foreign policy. And that American interest needs to be obviously a betterment. In other words, how does it make America better? That is the reward in our decision-making process here. What is the reward? We want to make America better, and how would we make it better? Well, we make it better by maybe getting the results of a stronger self-defense. In other words, insulate ourselves from the possible adventures of the Islamic State out toward Europe and eventually to the United States, with perhaps a conflict. Entering a conflict in the Middle East would help us in a self-defense area. But I don't see that as having I see that as only a low result on a betterment, because I don't see much danger coming from the Islamic State, at least not in the short term. So we're going to make an analysis here of the sacrifice versus the reward. We're going to place the sacrifice as medium if we were to become involved with a military undertaking yet again for the purposes of self-defense, which would be in our interest. The total result is a little on the low side, I would think. And the way that the candidates are talking about this is through bombing campaigns. Well, the bombing campaigns really are almost nil. Approximately 75% have come back without dropping any bombs at all. So I see that the rewards are very low, yet the involvement, the risk of the involvement is, I'm going to place it at a medium level. What are the other American interests in the Middle East? How would it better us? Well, there's a lot of wealth there, of course, through oil, and so again, the involvement is a medium level. If we are to involve ourselves on a military conflict again there, but the result could be very high, and because if we were to take over the oil wells now being held by the Islamic State, we could reap quite a bit of advantage there on twofold. One, it would deprive the Islamic State of that revenue by which they are running, and it would truly slow down their progress at becoming a state and becoming a terrorist state with their high degree of violence involved with their activities. And the only candidate that I have found that proposes this is the Trump candidacy. So I think that's a viable decision were it to be made. I don't really advocate it, but if it were to be employed, the risk-reward or the decision-making process toward the American interest is a decent reward, decent return on the involvement. Now, the other reason we would possibly think about becoming involved in the Middle East again is world interest. People declare us as the leader of the free world, and as such, we're expected to lead militarily throughout the world in order to ensure the safety of the free world. So the other candidates are proposing this through bombing again, and so we're going to place this this sacrifice versus the reward at medium versus low, because I don't see a huge danger coming out of military adventurism from the Middle East outward to Europe, to Asia, to the United States. So that's my quick assessment here. So I don't think that the bombings advocated or talked about by the candidates would have much effect, and I don't even think its efficacy is really worth talking about. But the involvement to squash the revenue coming from to ISIS from oil, that's something that could be thought about. And I don't think world safety is really a viable thing to think about. I don't think ISIS poses much danger to world safety. But enough of me. Let's find out what Rick thinks about the Middle East and the foreign policies that the candidates should have in their quest to become president of the United States. Rick, what's your assessment of the situation?
Well, I think there are two related issues that have to be unpacked. One is the fact that you've got rising powers in the form of Russia and Iran, traditional powers that are trying to recapitulate their former empires, and they're both very aggressively pursuing that. And the United States has little choice but to confront these powers in a traditional sense through deterrence, through negotiation, a mixture of threats, carrot sticks, and the usual tools that have been used for centuries when a larger power, in this case the United States, is coping with upstart powers that are seeking to gain territory, gain influence, and have their own set of interests that they're very aggressively pursuing, which in general don't line up with ours. Russian interests do not line up with ours very well. We've seen that borne out in the Middle East with their engagement there, where they're bombing the allies of the United States in Syria, in the Ukraine, where they've taken over large portions of Ukrainian territory, despite a treaty-bound obligation on the part of the United States to defend the Ukraine in exchange for removing their nuclear arsenal. So that's one issue. The current administration is obviously flailing when it comes to that. They may have, through negotiations, slowed down the Iranians and the Russians, a bit, but they haven't changed the direction of that expansion at all, actually. And the fact that the Iranians and the Russians are so dismissive of the United States is somewhat shocking, given the imbalance, the apparent imbalance in military power. So the United States has not been successful with creating a credible deterrent that actually causes those particular powers to think again or reconsider what they're doing, whether it be in Iraq or Syria or elsewhere. There seems to be very little fear on the part of the Russians and the Iranians toward the United States, and that's a problem for a big power when they're not feared. Now, then there's the ISIS issue. The problem with ISIS is it's not constrained to operating simply in the Middle East. It's creating organizations all over the world, and very actively in Africa, obviously, in Europe. Hasn't really come to the United States yet. There have been obviously incidents, murders that have been ISIS inspired, but nothing on the scale that we see in Europe or more to the point in Africa. And you could argue, as for example Obama does, that well, these are small-scale attacks in the United States, and they don't pose a strategic threat. That is to say, there's no risk that ISIS is going to conquer the United States or remove the ability of the United States to prosper as an economy. I think at a very basic level, that could be argued, but terrorism, allowing for terrorism and not confronting terrorism in a way that, frankly, fights fire with fire, that is to say, if a known terrorist is plotting a terror attack using all reasonable means at one's disposal to kill that terrorist, it's almost a mark of a lack of civilization when these kinds of attacks are allowed to continue with no real confrontation. So I don't see any alternative to the United States and other Western powers aggressively tracking down terrorists. It doesn't require an invasion. Obviously, there's nothing to invade, really. They work like guerrilla fighters. They have to be attacked in a very subtle and ongoing way, frankly, probably for years to come. But to dismiss the ISIS threat as not a serious issue for the United States and the Western powers is, I think, a bit short-sighted. They must be confronted. They can't simply be allowed to set up cells in other countries because they're actively destabilizing governments, particularly in Africa, but potentially elsewhere. And that's leading to millions of refugees, which is in turn affecting the European economy, which is now dealing with an enormous problem that they don't have any solution for, apparently. I mean, the follow-on effects of these phenomena are very, very significant and very, very costly. The European Union is spending billions of dollars as we speak dealing with their refugees. Billions of dollars.
Well, what do you think about then the solution is really an immigration problem, not allowing those who have the potential to create terrorist events, not allowing them into the Western countries?
Well, I mean, that's already happened in Europe, right? It's known that several of the terrorists who were responsible for the killings in Paris came through the refugee network. That and that will happen again. I mean, that's a guarantee. When you're dealing with millions of refugees, and there's, as the head of the FBI, Mr. Comey, has testified before Congress, there is no database to check up on the background of these people. These are failed states. So basically, you know, it's a crapshoot in terms of being able to screen out the mostly male, as it happens, refugees who have few, if any, skills, don't speak the local languages, and are fleeing to countries where unemployment is unchanged, including in Germany, well, possibly with the exception of Germany, but basically unchanged across Europe since 2008. It still sits at 10%, has not gone down at all, and in some countries, the unemployment rates are 12, 15, 17, 18, 25%, depending on where you look. Spain, Italy, France, Greece. So there's no capacity to absorb these refugees in terms of finding jobs, and they are mostly males.
So in order to dampen the potential for the spread of terrorists coming out of the ISIS state or the Islamic State, is immigration one factor by which the Western countries should use in order to limit that potential?
Well, I mean, if you're suggesting that promoting immigration is going to somehow settle the problems in the Middle East, I think that's absolutely ludicrous. Promoting immigration will promote more immigration.
No, I meant the opposite. In other words, constructing a policy which limits immigration from those countries.
It has to be a very severe policy. It never should have happened in the first place. Safe zones should have been created in Syria by the Western Allies and the United States. Aid brought into Syria actions taken to protect people that were at risk, but bringing them into Europe, where you've got a very expensive welfare system that's already overburdened and enormously inflated unemployment rates, is a recipe for disaster. You're already seeing immigrants setting fire to camps in northern France because they're known as the one in Calais is known as the jungle, and so it's not surprising, because there are no jobs, there's no place to put these people, that they coalesce in particularly poor areas, and they're creating what will surely be potential terrorist cells over time, because they are dispossessed people.
Then further, besides immigration,
simply support them, put them in apartments, and put the burden on the French or the Swiss or the German taxpayer, and further increase the welfare state in Europe, which is already crushing these economies that are growing at less than 1% a year.
Okay, let's get back to American interest, though. So American interest, besides limiting, perhaps altering or dampening the refugee immigration to hopefully stop the potential for terrorist activities coming from the Middle East to here, should a military option, or should this talk about bombing proceed? What do you think?
Well, I don't think indiscriminate bombing is going to do anything. It hasn't done anything yet. The Russians have targeted their bombing at certain allies in Syria, and that has hurt them. But I think bombing has to be very, very targeted. There should be a comprehensive effort to create safe zones. It's not too late. It's not too late to start sending these refugees back into safe zones. Probably most will not qualify for asylum. But in the meantime, there's enormous cost that Europe in particular is bearing. And the problem is that if the United States doesn't serve its European allies and attempts to go it all alone, it becomes very costly for the United States as well. There has to be an element of cooperation. We are part of NATO after all.
Right.
This is a shared threat.
Okay. Rick, I want to thank you for your views, and that concludes this week's version of the Philosophical Angle. And we'll see you next week. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.